Welcome to Constitution Podcast with Douglas V. Gibbs. This is an extension of Constitution Radio on KMET 1490 AM. You can learn more about the radio show, where to find it and all that with the links below. politicalpistachio.com, douglasvgibbs.com. Hit the radio link for the radio show. We are going to talk about what's going on right now, the violence, Black Lives Matter, all of that. But from a constitutional point of view, this is not about party, this is not about ideology, this is about the U.S. Constitution and solutions. People, after hearing a lot about what's right and what's wrong with going on, usually at the end of a speech that I give, or someone like maybe Sheriff Mack, Richard Mack of the Constitution Sheriffs and Peace Officer Association gives, which I saw him a couple of Sundays ago, and this was the question at the end of the speech. Yeah, but what do we do? What are the solutions? So let's talk some solutions here. I'm going to, first of all, set it up so that you understand why we have the ability to do what we do and work towards that. So we're going to go through a lot of documents. You can see on the right-hand side there, on your right, on the video, looks like some spillover, some documents. That's because we got a lot of things to go over, and there were just so many of them, they started spilling over. So here we go. All right. And honestly, I'm going to be going through a number of documents for you. So and wording in the Constitution. So just be ready. Okay. So let's start with the definition of insurrection. Now, I purposely picked up these from the internet and gave you a screenshot with a picture so that there's no question about where it came from. So you can see the Google logo there and everything else. So this is their definition. And if you go down about 2/3 down, it says a violent uprising against an authority or government. A violent uprising against an authority or government. So first of all, based on their definition, and this is, to me, the definition has been around like forever, the Black Lives Matter and Antifa and all these groups that are out there, these leftist groups that are burning things and rioting and so forth, they are committing insurrection, a violent uprising against an authority or government. They say they're up against the police or against systemic racism, which is in the system thanks to the government, according to them. So what they are committing is insurrection based on their own definitions. Okay, now we have in front of us the definition of rebellion. What is a rebellion? And according to, once again, Google, this is the online dictionary, it is an act of violent or open resistance to an established government or ruler. An act of violent or open resistance to an established government or ruler. All right, so they are openly defiant against the established government. In fact, Ilhan Omar put out I think it was a tweet that said that not only do we need to get rid of the police, but we need to get rid of this oppressive government system. So she's verbally told you that it's a rebellion. All right, now we're going to look at the definition of a republic. What is a republic? And our system is a republic, or at least it's supposed to. When you pledge allegiance to the flag, it's to the republic for which it stands, correct? All right. So the word republic, derived from the Latin res publica, or public thing, refers to a form of government where the citizens conduct their affairs for their own benefit rather than for the benefit of a ruler. Historically, republics have not always been democratic in character. We're not supposed to be a democracy. This is supposed to be a republic, but it is a public thing, consent to the governed. And we'll get a little bit more to that as we move forward. According to Thomas Paine, as we were creating our system, first with independence and what he hoped we would become, in his book Common Sense, he called for a representative government for the colonies and a written constitution. Written constitution happened, and there is a representation in the government, House of Representatives originally. The other parts, because we're a republic, were not so much supposed to be voted in. We'll get to that once again. But Thomas Paine did call for a representative government. Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorite founding fathers, proposed that colonists reject the monarchy and become Republican citizens. Framers of the U.S. Constitution intended to create a Republican government. What is a republic? A republic is one that has checks and balances, and it is not a democracy. We'll mention what they meant by democracy in a minute, but in the system, in the federal part of the system, the only part of the federal government that was actually voted in democratically was the House of Representatives. The president was elected by electors through an electoral college, and the U.S. Senate the members of the U.S. Senate were appointed by the state legislatures. The states also are supposed to be Republican forms of government, in which the assembly is voted in by the people, and the state senate is supposed to be appointed by the county leadership, and then it's supposed to be one senator per county. Like you have 2 senators per state. It's a set number per county regardless of population. In the name of democracy, the county leadership lost their voice in the state senate. Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, in which the Warren Court explained that it wasn't democratic enough. Well, it's not supposed to be democratic. We are supposed to be a republic. In the dictionary about republic, they continue about Thomas Jefferson, saying that the framers of the Constitution intended to create a Republican form of government. Article 4, Section 4 states, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. We'll go over that in a little bit. Though the language was vague, and I don't think it was, it guarantees to every state Republican form of government. So now the question is, how do they guarantee it? We have to ask that question. How does the federal government, the United States, guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government? We'll get to that. Though the language was vague, the authors of the Constitution clearly intended to prevent the rise to power of either a monarchy or hereditary aristocracy. Article 1, Section 9 states, no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and most state constitutions have similar provisions. So, from a founder's point of view, according to the dictionary, it was all about guarding against a by-birth leadership, which would be nobility, monarchy, hereditary aristocracy, a dictatorship where, like in Cuba, where Castro's brother wound up taking over because it was family, and so on and so forth. And finally, on our Republic definition page, it says, the guarantee of Republican government was designed to provide a national remedy. I don't like the word national. We're not a nation. We are a federation of states. That's why it's a federal government. So I'm not a fan of the word national, but nonetheless, this is what the public dictionary, the free dictionary online, says. The guarantee of Republican government was designed to provide a national remedy for domestic insurrection, threatening the state governments, and to prevent the rise of a monarchy, about which there was some talk at the time. James Madison, the author of many of the essays included in the Federalist Papers, put forward a sophisticated concept of Republican government. He explained in Federalist number 10 that a republic must be contrasted with a democracy. In other words, it is not a democracy. The purer you become of a democracy, the closer you get to catastrophe. In the 18th century, the term democracy meant what is now called a pure or direct democracy, because what they've done with the word democracy is they have tainted it by adding all kinds of other things. Well, we have a representative democracy, and this democracy, and that, and social democracy, and so on and so forth. And so the dictionary has to narrow it down. Well, what they meant was a pure direct democracy. Okay, well, if you can go with what they originally intended, then, in other words, that shouldn't be the vote for the people across the board. We don't want democracy or mob rule. There are mechanisms that are supposed to be in place to counteract that. I remember when I was watching the Ferguson riots on television, and the news crew, was showing the burning buildings, and some kid comes running up the camera and he screams, "This is what democracy looks like." And I responded in my head, yep, that's exactly what democracy looks like, mob rule. In the 18th century, the term democracy meant what is now called a pure or direct democracy, wherein legislation is made by a primary assembly of citizens, as existed in several rural Swiss cantons and in New England towns. In a pure democracy, Madison argued, there is no check on the majority to protect the weaker party or individuals, and therefore such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, where rights of personal security and property are always in jeopardy. Is that not what we're seeing now? Jefferson called it the tyranny of the majority, where 51% can vote away the rights of the 49%. So checks and balances in our system are in place on purpose so that we're not a democracy. So when you have all of these people in the media and all of these experts out there talking about our democracy, that should bother you, because we're not supposed to be a democracy. Okay, so we know that we're not supposed to be a democracy, and we know in our history that the United States didn't begin with a standing army. We began with state militias. And you see in movies and reading your history books about the militias of the different states who participated in the Revolutionary War and even in the war between the states. All right, well, in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, which Article 1, Section 8 begins with the words, the Congress shall have the power to. So you see all these twos on these clauses. The Congress shall have the power preempts that word to. It says Congress shall have the power to, this is Clause 15, Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Okay, so the militia is in place to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, which we have shown that what's going on is an insurrection, and repel invasions. I would consider illegal entry in the United States an invasion. I underlined militia and suppress insurrections. Suppress insurrections is one of the reasons for calling forth the militia, but now I have militia underlined. Who is the militia? George Mason said that the militia was whole of the citizens and a few politicians. So when we talk about the militia, we're not just talking about the official state militias, which 24 states have, but really we're talking about the unorganized militia. And the unorganized militia, we have the question, who calls them up? Or who do they work for? We'll get to that. Okay, you remember earlier we were talking about how the United States must guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. That is found in Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, which you are now looking at. But now let's read the whole thing, because there's more to it than just that. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government, which we've talked about, and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. Okay, what does it mean on application of the legislature? It means there must be a law that's put forth. In other words, yes, the Constitution says that the federal government's job is to protect the states against domestic violence, that's what we're seeing, but there must be law in place. The Insurrection Act is one of those laws. Our Congress can pass others for the president to execute. The president, which is the executive, his job is to execute law. Now, that said, it says that the executive can guarantee each state a Republican form of government, protect them against invasion and against domestic violence, but that's when the legislature cannot be convened. Well, when would the legislature not be able to convene? Perhaps when the domestic violence is so bad they can't get to Washington. So it gives an out so that the president, if he needs to, can do it himself. But typically, there needs to be a law in place. Once again, we have the Insurrection Act. That's one of them. I think it was 1807, I think, something like that. That was put into place. And that's the application of the legislature this is talking about. So the federal government has the authority to protect the states against domestic violence. And as we saw in a past slide, it's Congress's job to call up the militia to carry that out. Doesn't say the military. Remember, it said the militia. Okay, so now the question is, when the militia is called up, who's in charge? Ultimately, the president is. It says in Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Remember, Congress has to call the militia actual service of the United States. Otherwise, the state militia belongs to the state. But if Congress calls them forward, then the president becomes the commander-in-chief. All right, so who does the militia work for then when president's not commander-in-chief? The state. But who in the state really is in charge of the militias? Who in the state is the one that trains and works with them and all that. We will get to that. But let's stay with the president for a second. So we have the president, who's commander-in-chief over the militias when they are called into the actual service of the United States. We do have a historical precedent of when the president acted as a commander-in-chief over the militia. And in fact, there's one case in history in which the president actually went into the field of battle with the militias. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion. So let's read this little bit about the Whiskey Rebellion to help us understand the president's relationship with the militias and who it is that's supposed to be involved in suppressing insurrection. President Washington sought to resolve this dispute peacefully. In 1792, he issued a national proclamation admonishing Westerners for their resistance to the operation of the laws of the United States for raising revenue upon spirits distilled within the same. However, by 1794, the protests became violent. Talking about the Whiskey Rebellion once again. In July, nearly 400 whiskey rebels near Pittsburgh set fire to the home of John Neville, the regional tax collection supervisor. Left with little recourse and at the urgings of Secretary Hamilton, Washington organized a militia force of 12,950 men. Notice it was not the standing army. And led them towards western Pennsylvania, warning locals not to abet, aid, or comfort the insurgents. Interesting language, abet, aid, or comfort the insurgents aforesaid. Could that be language that's saying that this is treasonous by committing an insurgency? Not to abet, aid, or comfort the insurgents aforesaid, as they will answer the contrary at their peril. The calling of the militia, once again, Congress had to call the militia, and then once they were called into the actual service of the United States, the president was the commander-in-chief over them, had the desired effect of essentially ending the Whiskey Rebellion. By the time the militia reached Pittsburgh, the rebels had dispersed and could not be found. The militia apprehended approximately 150 men and tried them for treason. Okay, so the Whiskey Rebellion, an insurgency, a rebellious violence over a tax, and they were tried for treason. Such an insurgency, according to the founding fathers, and at the time that George Washington was president, was treason. The paucity of evidence and the inability to obtain witnesses hampered the trials. Two men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were found guilty of treason, though both were pardoned by President Washington. In other words, he wanted to send a message that, yes, it was treason, but we're not going to kill you over it. It was, for example, simply a rebellion over a tax. And, well, I have a feeling that while Washington signed the tax, deep down he was not totally hip with it. By 1802, then President Thomas Jefferson repealed the excise tax on whiskey. Under the eye of President Washington, the nascent United States survived the first true challenge to federal authority. Now, once again, the federal authority is not to be confused here. The states created the federal government. They are the parents over the federal government. So the federal government serves the states. However, if it is a constitutional authority and the federal government has a law in place or is expected to follow the Constitution on something, they do have authority on that, and we've already seen that the federal government has the authority to ensure domestic. So who is it? Who is it that's supposed to be involved here? Because, I mean, I don't see President Trump hopping on a horse and riding in with the militias into these riot zones around the United States. So who is it that's supposed to be working with the militia? Who is it that is supposed to be our guy on the ground saying, all right, this is going to stop. This stuff stops now. The federal government, according to the U.S. Constitution, has the authority to stop this insurrection, and we've got the militia here to take care of it. Whose job is it? Historically, and, well, really constitutionally, it's the job of the sheriff. Let's read what is a sheriff. It was a article by Jessica Pishko about a year ago, and here's what she wrote. If the sheriff sounds like something from the American frontier, that's because it is. The role of sheriff goes back to England, where sheriffs were usually appointed by the crown and other officials to oversee the laws of the shire or county. Duties included tax collection and running a local militia, also called the posse comitatus, citizens who would moonlight as law enforcement. Stop. Who is the militia? George Mason said, the whole of the people and a few politicians. Who runs the militia locally? Your sheriff. That is his job. So if the president needs the federal laws or federal constitution followed, and he's not necessarily going to come riding in on a horse like George Washington, who does it? The sheriff. Let's continue. In America, sheriffs play a particularly pivotal role in southern states where they served as chief law enforcement officers. Northeast states relied on constables, who are more like the police chiefs of today. Sheriffs got to take cuts from fees, one of the perks of the job, in addition to collecting salaries. As America expanded westward, those states adopted the Southern sheriff model, which is also, remember, the English model. As states drafted their constitutions, they often included an elected sheriff position. Right now, at least 40 states have elected sheriffs. All 50 should. All 50 should. But that said, notice it is an elected position. The governor can't say, that's it, I'm firing the sheriff. He doesn't work for the governor. The sheriff works for those who elected him. And who is the sheriff? He is the last line of defense against unconstitutionality and to promote our Constitution locally. Continue. In many regions, especially in the South, sheriffs still have wide jurisdiction and primary law enforcement responsibilities. Unlike police chiefs, who usually report to mayors or other elected officials, sheriffs have fewer checks on the power. Why? Because they're elected by the people. Many sheriffs serve long stints in office, and some are in place for decades. If the people like them, they keep re-electing them. So, the sheriff is your local constitutional law enforcement. Your sheriff is your local constitutional executive. He's there to execute the Constitution locally. And he's there to run the militias. So if the militias are needed for something, it is the sheriff's job to put those militias into play. So what about these politicians, though, that are supporting the insurrection? All right, we already know that the people out in the streets that are looting and starting fires and calling for a change in the American system, that it's based on systemic racism and all that jazz, we know those people are committing insurrection and rebellion, and it is the job of our government to suppress that insurrection and rebellion, and that they have the constitutional authority to do so, not only from a federal standpoint, but for the sheriff with the local militia. But what about those politicians that are supporting the insurrection and aiding the insurrection and calling for rebellion? Like I mentioned Ilhan Omar earlier, saying, well, we need to overthrow the American system. What about them? One of the problems is that those politicians and persons holding office that are aiding and abetting the insurrection, the rebellion, Black Lives Matter, these groups, they believe that they cannot be arrested because it says that they have a privilege from arrest, which I'll get to in a minute. But before we get there, what about their oath of office? What about the fact that they are aiding and abetting this insurrection and rebellion as office holders? Well, first of all, according to the Constitution, they should be arrested and removed. They are guilty of the insurrection and rebellion as well, and they shall not only be removed from office, but they should not be allowed to hold office again. 14th Amendment, Section 3. Listen carefully. Now, this was designed for those who held office and supported the Confederacy, the southern states, in the war between the states. But if you read the Congressional Globe, which is the congressional record of the time, the language is very specific because they want to make sure it never happens again. Listen carefully to the words. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who have previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer to any states to support the Constitution of the United States. All right, so if you have given that oath to the United States and you have violated that oath, you're in trouble. Let's continue. Shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. So you shall not hold office if you have given any aid or comfort to insurrectionists or rebels, or you have engaged in that insurrection or rebellion. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Your only chance of ever holding office again is if both houses of Congress, by 2/3 vote, votes to remove that disability. Otherwise, you're done. Now, how do you enforce this? I mentioned that earlier. It goes back to our Congress. Goes back. Well, wait a second. Like I said, these people believe they have a privilege from arrest. Article 1, Section 6, they shall, in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to or returning from the same. Okay, first of all, there's a couple of exemptions there, isn't there? Treason and breach of the peace. So you can arrest them even while they're sitting in their seat in Congress. If it's based on treason, which we saw insurrectionist treason, remember with the Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion, and they tried these people for treason. So this insurrection and rebellion, a call for an overthrow of our U.S. Constitution, is treason and breach of the peace. It's also a breach of the peace. But let's say, hey, they still say, you know what? No, we're still privileged from arrest while we're attending our respective houses. Okay, fine. But when you go home and Congress is not in session, no problem. The militia and the sheriff can come to your district office or your home and arrest you there for the same. So they're not privileged from arrest. They think they are. They are not. Either we can arrest them right there in their seat, because it is treason, it is breach of the peace. Or, if they really want to play that hardball, fine, that's okay. I'll wait until they go home. And then have our constitutional sheriff and the militia arrest that politician. And as I said in the 14th Amendment, make sure they never, ever hold any office again. And of course, there are constitutional authorities that are here. What is the purpose of the Constitution in the first place? Let's go to the preamble. We the people of the United States, in order to, these are the reasons for the writing of the Constitution and the creation of the federal government. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Ensure domestic tranquility. That is one of the reasons for the writing of the Constitution, and it is one of the reasons for the creation of the federal government. It is one of the reasons we are a constitutional republic. Now, remember earlier I said, based on the Whiskey Rebellion, that the insurrection, rebellion, be it over paying a whiskey tax, or what Black Lives Matter and Antifa and the hard left is doing in the streets right now here in America, it is treason. What is treason? Article 3, Section 3 says, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them being the states, or adhering to their enemies and giving them aid or comfort. All right? Who are our enemies? Our enemies are socialism, the communists, China, Marxism. Go to Black Lives Matter's website. They are all about three things: Marxism, homosexuality, and transgenderism. They are about Marxism. They mean to overthrow our government. They are levying war against us right now with their domestic violence. Remember how it was very difficult, though, to convict people of treason with the Whiskey Rebellion? Remember when we were reading that? The next part explains that. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. It's hard to do. Now let's discuss one other thing about treason. Let's go a little bit further here. Below the definition of treason, in Article 3, Section 3, Clause 2, it says, the Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, which currently it is death, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. Corruption of blood was an important thing to the founders. What this meant is that you're not guilty of the sins of your father. In other words, to say that someone is guilty and has to pay retribution or restitution to another group for something that their ancestors did is ridiculous. There is no corruption of blood. The founders didn't believe in corruption of blood. You are your own person. You make your own decisions. I mean, think about it. How foolish is it to ask people who never owned slaves to apologize to people who never were slaves. Your ancestors may have been. No corruption of blood. The sins of our fathers are washed away. Or as the image you're looking at, asking her to apologize for slavery is like asking her to apologize for Pearl Harbor. How ridiculous is that? Well, hopefully you learned something. Let's summarize real quick. So we have an insurrection going on. The federal government has the authority to say this stops now. Congress has already, long ago, passed the Insurrection Act. The president may put the militia in play, and our sheriffs should lead them to stop this garbage now. Black Lives Matter is an insurrection. It is a rebellion against our U.S. Constitution, and there are constitutional authorities through our sheriffs, through our militias, and through our president to stop it. And as we end this video, united we stand, combined we kick butt. God bless America, and God bless you. Where we go one, we go all. I want to give you one more thing to think about as I say adieu on this video. Read carefully. The truth sometimes is more obvious than we realize. Thanks for watching.